greetings, salutations, and all that stuff. Hope your week's treating you well. It is a beautiful day, a great week. Thank you for being here tonight. Excited for our Bible study in 1 Kings chapter 2. We made our way back there having finished 2 Chronicles, and so we're through that. Now we're going to flip on back to 1 Kings, the second chapter. As we get into it tonight, I want you all to think about something with me. Whether your fathers are living or deceased, consider if Dad could only have one more conversation with you and you with him, what is it that you would say to him? What is it that he, more importantly for tonight's discussion, would say to you? What do you think your dad would say to you if you only had one more conversation, he only had one more piece of advice that he could hand on to you? What would come to mind? Okay, well, that's what we're going to be considering tonight, and I feel like it's very fitting. Fathers are special people, and of course in a few weeks someone dreamed it up. Hey, how about, isn't it second Sunday in June? Why don't we make that Father's? Okay, well, I'm one of those, hey, let's celebrate the important people all the time. I'm not real big on these single day kind of things. But I think it's fitting that with this right around the corner that we can consider the interaction between a father and his son, the last conversation, or at least significant one, that's going to take place between them. So, as I mentioned, I'm sorry? Oh, really? Well, that is interesting. And it makes a lot of... I'm sorry? Okay. And it makes a lot of sense because I don't know of any males that would have said, hey, let's do this. And, I don't know if you're that way, but myself, I would rather it not be in existence personally. Again, I think fathers are important. We celebrate them all the time. But that's just me. Is someone going to say something? Okay, all right. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings 2, and we're going to start in verse 1. This last piece of advice that's given from dad to son. Now the days of David drew near that he should die. And that doesn't really sound, I guess, all that significant in the grand scheme of things. But, I don't know if you're as weak sometimes just on a personal level as what I am. But I kind of get invested in these characters and their lives and the interest of what's going on. It's kind of sad, isn't it? We've had all of these great stories and teachings involving King David, and he's just like everyone else. It's going to come to an end, and the scene's going to shift, and someone else is going to step onto the stage, and the curtain will be lifted on their lives. Well, the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, who would like to state tonight's memory verse? A short and pretty sweet one. Okay. So you just say the same thing. Okay, that's all right. I didn't want to leave you out. Right. Well, it would seem to be a young adult, and part of it would depend too, Bathsheba and the relationship and your dating, and we do know about David's life when it ends. And yeah, it would seem like David's an old man, and Solomon's probably the oldest, somewhere around a young adult. Yeah, maybe even late teen. Yeah. Do what? Right. Yeah. So I'm with you. The evidence seems to be in the young adulthood range. Yeah, makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Thanks. All right, so there are three things that I want to examine in our memory verse right here, and it's about dads. We're going to reflect on this just a little bit. So David's about to die, and he has this parting advice that he supplies to his son. The first thing he says is, I go the way of all the earth. And I really believe, again, this is short and a sweet one. It doesn't seem like there's a lot here, but I think there's more than what maybe meets the eye when you consider it. I go the way of all the earth. And, it's just hard to imagine that the person that has been such a source of strength and support could ever be gone. It's like, it's a reality. One of those things is going to happen, but it's just like you can't imagine that it's really even possible. I know with my own father, it's been almost 2 years now, and every day I still think it doesn't even seem like that's a possibility, and I think I'll probably live out the rest of my life and that it's going to be that way. And you have this father with his son, and he says, hey, it's going to happen to me just like everybody else. And it happens. You see it all around, but just the fact of it's occurring is such a strange thing. I go the way of all the earth. He says in the second portion of our memory work, be strong, therefore. Man, it's a difficult thing. And I don't believe that one can ever just fully grasp how much he or she relies upon Dad until Dad just isn't there anymore, of course, in this place. And so to push through in a moment of weakness and to show strength even in that. And the third thing is this: prove yourself a man. And I'm with you, Roy. I think he's probably a very old child or a very young adult, somewhere in that range. And you can think that you have a lot of strength, whether it's physically, mentally, spiritually. But again, once that person's out of your life in this place, it is really eye-opening. I just don't think we really fully comprehend how much we depend physically, mentally, and spiritually on parents, even as we venture into adulthood. And this is going to be his opportunity. He says, just like you've seen me, just like you've relied on me and my wisdom and to help you sort through your problems, now it's going to be your own. And you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to go on and live your life. We had the analogy, 1 to 2 weeks ago, I think it's a fairly decent one, about a father teaching his child how to ride a bike. And the father starts the child out with training wheels. But eventually you get to the spot where you have to take those wheels off the bike, the training portion of them. And then Dad will still, or maybe Mom also, but Dad a lot of times is seen with his hand on the child's back or helping hold the bike up and getting it going. But eventually, Dad has to let go. And child's either going to ride that bike really well or child's going to crash and burn. We all know how riding a bike works in the beginning. Eventually, a child is going to crash and burn. But the individual has to decide, am I going to stay down or am I going to get up? Am I going to take my bike back home and put it in the garage or in the barn and never use it again? Or am I going to get back on that bike and keep after it until I get it down? What's going on right here is the training wheels have been on Solomon's bike. Dad's been helping him through. Dad took the training wheels off and he still has his hand on his back, still holding a little bit on it, but he's about to let go of that bike and let go of his son. He's all on his own. Sink or swim. He's going to have some failures. But whether you prove yourself to be a man, ladies, whether you prove yourself to be a woman, isn't so much whether you have any fallings off that bike, but what you choose to do from that point forward. Joe? Yeah, very well said, Joe. Okay, any others? Number 3. And this is really on his mind right here. Son, if I've learned anything, this is what I ask of you to do. Don't forget, keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and that's how he wants things done, to keep his statutes or his rules, his commandments, the orders that he's provided, his judgments, what he deems to be correct, and his testimonies, what he's explained and conveyed to you, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. He's letting him know not only is this your purpose in life, but it's also whether you're going to succeed in life. It's also whether you're going to enjoy life. So much of it has to do whether you focus on the Lord and his will. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Roy mentioned it's very similar to a charge that Joshua had given. But if you look back in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, it's also very similar to a charge that Moses had given. And I think a lot of it is, it's the Lord just continuing to give this charge, but through his people and in successive generations. So Deuteronomy 6 and the first few verses there. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules, notice the listing, several ways of saying the same thing with these synonyms, that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and, don't forget, pass it on to the next generation, your son and your son's sons, the next generation, your grandkids, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life. Now, we could look at this very selfishly if we wanted, and human beings, we tend to do that. Well, why should I do that? What's in that for me? And he explains, in case we would need it, an extra incentive. First of all, as you get down to verse 5, our number one motivation should be, well, we love God with all of our heart, our soul, our might. And it's not about anything that we could possibly get in return. It's just what he deserves, and we feel so strongly about him. But if we need that little extra motivation, especially in our earlier years, he says back in verse 2, that your days may be long. So it's potentially going to lengthen your life. In verse 3, hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, or that you will be blessed in your efforts, and that you may multiply greatly. It has to do with your success, your legacy, that of your families, and also of your nation. As the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. I just want to point something out before we move on in our text. Go to Matthew chapter 6. And this is a passage that we know pretty well, of course, from verse 33. And I don't know that we always focus as much on the verses around it. And this is really the center of all of it. But Matthew 6, going back to verse 31, Jesus taught under his system, the arrangement, this is the way things are going to work. He says, therefore, do not worry about what you should eat, what you should drink, what you should wear. For after all these things the Gentiles seek after, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Going back to the previous verses, these are physical things, and they're not just like amenities, but those are actually necessities of life. And he says, you have the promise from God. He will take care of, he will provide these things when you put the most important things first. Spiritual things first, and then he'll surround you with all the physical things that you need. Just don't put those physical things first. And then he goes on to say this in verse 34. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. You know, how much of a day do we spend planning and making preparations for important things, understood, but the things that we're going to need tomorrow, and the things that we're going to need the next week, and the things that we're going to need the next month, and the things we're going to need the next year, and the things we're going to need the next decade. We make all these plans about all these physical things, and we spend so much of our time trying to invest in all of these physical endeavors and blessings down the road. And sometimes in our preparations for the physical things of the future, we forget about the only thing that really matters for now. And what's that? But to seek God first and his righteousness. So we don't want to get so confused and to be so blinded by the future that we forget about the only thing really that matters here in the present. There's nothing wrong with looking for the future. There's nothing wrong with physical preparations for the future, but the most important things are the spiritual things now. And I simply want to identify, when we're in our text of 1 Kings 2, when this fatherly advice, the last thing he could ever say to his son, and he says the most important thing is this: you now have your opportunity. I'm handing the baton to you. I've done what I can to help you out. I'm not saying this is a criticism, but as an observation, and I think David would say that, and I know I could say of myself, I'd like to say David's done the best that he could as a father. I think he'd be the first to tell us, you know what, looking back, I probably didn't do the best I could have done as a father. I know I'm that way in my own life. I probably haven't done the best that I could really do with my kids. But if there's one thing that I could tell them is, hey, some of the positive qualities and the things I've tried to put in front of you and instill in you, it's your opportunity. Be strong. What's happening to me, don't let that lose your faith. It's the same thing that happens to everybody. It's the same thing one day it's going to happen to you, even though you probably can't imagine that about me, even though you probably can't imagine that by yourself. It happens to everyone. Be strong. Push through it. And now's your chance to become your own man and to do something with your life. Now's your chance to live for the Lord and to leave a legacy that matters. And if there's anything that I could identify to you, any last words I could give you, it's this: walk in the ways of the Lord. Do what he tells you. If you ever need any extra motivation, it's going to help you physically also. I mean, hopefully that's not our number one reason for doing that. But that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. And again, I just want to point out this isn't any new advice. It was what was given as the Israelites headed into the Promised Land about half a millennium prior to where we're studying right now. and 3,000 years later, it's still the truth of the Lord. It makes for a better life here if we just put the Lord first. Verse 4, that the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons, and now that's going to apply to Solomon, if Solomon takes heed to his way and walks before me in truth with all of his, but it's true of the other sons also, as you'll see the plural pronouns, their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul. How often in the Bible do we see, even in the Old Testament, it's not simply what we read in verse 3. Make sure you do what's right here. Make sure you don't do what's wrong over there. It all begins in verse 4. The walk with God, with the heart and with the soul being in the right place. We read from Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's so important to keep all the statutes and all the regulations and all the commandments of God. And then they're told, and here's the most important of all the commandments you need to keep. What is it? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And that's exactly what David's instilling within his child here. We want to be careful that we don't raise our children simply to look at what we enjoy in the Lord's family is just a bunch of regulations. That's not what it is. It's about a heart that chases after and loves God. By the way, why was it that the Lord ever selected David in the first place? How did he know he had the right guy? When the Israelites totally butchered it in their first choice, how did he know he had the right guy in this one? He says, I've rejected him because he will not obey my commandments. He's consistently demonstrated that about Saul, and he says, instead, through the prophet Samuel, the Lord has selected a man after his own heart, someone who understands and wants the very heart of God to be within him. There's one thing you could tell your child or your children, and it's the last thing you could say. What better advice is there to make sure that you've developed and you maintain a heart for your God? And if you have that, you're going to walk in his ways. You're going to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, all the things that are written. He said at the end of verse 4, if you will give me all of your heart and all of your soul, and not just me, but also instill that within your kids, or not just you, instill that within your children, within your grandchildren, he said, you're going to see great things if you want legacy in this country. I have given you the throne of Israel, and it's not going to end with you. But you keep passing this on from generation to generation, and you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So I would say here that David's handled the most important things. I don't know if it's like he only has 8 breaths left and he uses 4 of them right here. I don't know if it's something that's that concise, but he has covered the most important thing first. And now he's going to move on to other matters in the kingdom that need to be addressed. And perhaps some of these, maybe that he left unaddressed, or maybe that he just didn't see appropriate for him to deal with them at the given times. And now he expects his son to go about these in the right way to strengthen the nation. Verse 5, moreover, you know also what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, and what he did to the 2 other commanders, what he did to the 2 commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner, first of all, the son of Ner, and then later to Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed. And he shed the blood of war in peacetime, and put the blood of war on his belt that was around his waist, and on his sandals that were on his feet. Just very quickly, we're going to look at these. Turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 3. And we're not going to read every word of these, but I want to hit some highlights just to refresh ourselves of what it is that we're reading. And I think it is pretty important to comprehend why it is that he's giving this instruction to his son. So, 2 Samuel chapter 3, and we'll start in about verse 22. Let's look at that. 2 Samuel 3:22. And this is after the civil discord that took place in Israel for 7 years. There are 2 years of war that actually occurs, kind of like our country, if you'll recall, between the north and the south. Well, that's kind of on its way out, and the south here is winning over. It's the righteous part of the nation. Well, the servants of David, they arrive with Joab from a raid, bringing much spoil with them. Abner has just had a meeting. He was the general of Israel, and he was holding up Ishbosheth as the weak king who's the descendant of Saul. And they've made a deal, hey, let's bring all the nation back together because Ishbosheth has made Abner mad, and this is a great opportunity for David and all Israel. And so this agreement is made. Joab finds out that he's been here in this private meeting with the king, and he's upset that he's gone away alive from this meeting. He still sees him as the enemy, and he's not mainly concerned about unity in Israel. Does anybody recall why it is he doesn't want this guy to go alive, Abner? What did Abner do? He killed his brother, the 4-3-40 guy. Asahel, who wouldn't give up. Yeah, remember him? I know we've had a bunch of them. Same? Okay. Yeah. But the difference here is whenever Asahel was killed, what was going on at that time? That was in a battle. That was war. And furthermore, Abner was actually very generous to him, and he tries to tell him, dude, step back and leave me. I don't want to do anything. How am I ever going to see your brother Joab again? I mean, it's truly a civil conflict. I mean, these guys are just slaughtering each other back and forth, and they're just talking, while they're doing battle. I mean, it's a really strange thing. But he tries to talk him out of it, and he won't listen to him, so he ends up, taking care of business. What he has to do to preserve his own life in war. This is not a time of war. This is peace now. In verse 26, Joab comes out from David's presence, and he sends messengers after Abner and brings him back, but David didn't know about it. Verse 27, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the midst of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the stomach so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. If you notice afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord. For the blood of Abner, the son of Ner, I'm not responsible. This was not my idea. I don't consent. May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. And may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge or is leprous or holds a spindle or falls by the sword or who lacks bread. And then we're told plainly in verse 30, so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle and war at Gibeon. But the difference is one was war and self-defense, and this one is in times of peace and it's cold-blooded murder. Now, I think people can make a case, and a very convincing one, that maybe David should have dealt with this matter as a king. But it's earlier on in his reign, and he doesn't do such a thing. In the very least, maybe remove this guy from being the general of the country. He doesn't do that. You could certainly make a case of putting him to death for murder, as law would demand. He doesn't do that, and he just lets it continue, and there are more problems that come from this guy. Joe? Mm-hmm. Yep, same thing. Yeah, good. And I think it was with the butt of his spear or something, wasn't it? Yeah. Oof. Yeah. So I'm with you. I think there's a reason that he does it that way. It's just revenge, straight out revenge through and through. Right. Yep. Sad truth. Okay, chapter 20. Make your way there. 2 Samuel, chapter 20, and same thing. We won't read every word, but just want to hit some highlights here. So this is after the rebellion of Absalom, David's son. That's been quieted. And now we have a rebellion of, verse 1, a guy named Sheba, and the descriptor used of him, he is a worthless man. And so right after this, he says, hey, let's have another rebellion. The first one was so much fun, and we don't want to follow this guy anyway, David. So all the men, verse 2, once again withdraw from David and follow Sheba. But the men of Judah follow their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. Verse 4. The king said to Amasa, call the men of Judah here together, and he's serving as the general. And if you recall, after maybe a little bit of another blunder on the part of Joab, and certainly an insult toward David, David removes him finally, after decades of service, from being his general, and he puts the guy of whom we're reading right now, he puts him in charge in Amasa. So the king says to Amasa, hey, we need to get the guys of Judah together. Do it within 3 days, be here yourself. So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed for him, which might not sound like a monster deal. But in war, if you're not ready, when it's time to go, the other side's not going to say, oh, okay, well, we'll just go watch a movie today, and then we'll come back and we'll do battle. No, you have to be ready like yesterday, and he's not prepared. Very early, he's failing on the job. And if you go down below, there's the mentioning of Joab coming onto the scene in verse 8. They were at the great stone that is in Gibeon, and Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword and a sheath fastened on his thigh. And as he went forward, it fell out. Now, do you think an army general of many decades survives so many terrible conflicts, just every now and then just loses his weapon and can't hardly get a hold of it? This isn't accidental. He pretends that it just falls out. And Joab said to Amasa, is it well with you, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand, so Joab stuck him with it in the stomach. He likes that region, doesn't he, when he gets people. And spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. Why do you think Joab might want to take Amasa out here? I mean, they're supposed to be like kind of on the same side. I think it's just vengeance and envy. Once again, his position has been taken by this guy that he probably feels like it belongs to me. And so he just kills him in cold blood, and strangely, he ends up then getting his position back. And once again, I would say, David probably has his opportunity, in the very least, not to let this guy serve once again, and you can make the case to put him to death because he is a cold-blooded murderer. But he doesn't. He allows him to stick around, and he continues causing problems in the kingdom of Israel. So back in our text, 1 Kings 2:5. Moreover, you know also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel. I mean, it's bad enough if you murder just somebody, but you murder guys that are so high up in the government of our own country. And he shed the blood of war in peacetime. Verse 6, therefore do according to your wisdom. What do you think ought to be done with a cold-blooded murderer who's really kind of a little bit of a traitor in our own country? Well, what do you think you ought to do about that, son? Do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. In other words, make him pay for his crimes. Does anyone else find it strange that David has decades to handle this? And he never does it. But to his son coming in, hey, one of the first things you need to do is have this guy executed. Okay. I mean, he's right, isn't he? But again, maybe he's looking back on his own life. I mentioned to you, I'm sure David would say it. I know I say it of mine. Well, I can tell you plenty of parenting mistakes so far. And I think that's his too. He wants his son to be a better king than what he is. So take care of these matters. Don't let them fester as I did. Verse 7. Not everyone, needs to die. Verse 7, show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For so they came to me when I fled from Absalom, your brother. I don't think we'll read about that one because I would like to. One other one that's down here I find pretty interesting. Verse 8, and see you have with you Shimei, the son of Gerah, a Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a malicious curse in the day when I went to Mahanaim. But he came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. I do want to read just a little bit about this one. Chapter 16 of 2 Samuel. 16, and as with the other two, we'll hit some highlights of this. But if you look in the context that precedes, you might recall back in chapter 15 is where you have Absalom trying to take over, and is actually very successful in taking over the government of Israel and becoming king, well, kind of, being named king anyway. And David has to run away from his own city over which he's ruled for so many decades. And as he's essentially running away, verse 5 of chapter 16, when King David came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually. And he threw stones at David, and all the servants of King David, and all the people, and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. Here he is just ridiculing the king, the true king, in their presence. And Shimei said as he cursed, "Get out. Get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood." Now Abishai, who so happens to be a son of Zeruiah, these guys, sons of Zeruiah, Asahel, Joab, and Abishai, what's their solution to everything? We haven't noticed already. Joab, what's he do whenever someone makes him mad? Okay, he's going to kill him. And it may be years later, but you're still going to pay for it. You will die. So Abishai, one of the sons of Zeruiah, and by the way, when Abner's being chased around by Asahel, what's his solution? I'm not going to quit until you're dead. That's the only way this could end well. And he loses his life because of that. Joab, he's constantly killing people. You see this in the brothers. Abishai, the other one, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? I have the perfect solution. Let me go over and take off his head." Okay, very loving family, it seems like. But that's their solution to everything. It's violence. And you can understand here, but the king said, the true king, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? Why are you always like this? Can you not have a rational conversation? Behold," he says, "my own son seeks my life. How much more now this Benjamite? Leave him alone and let him curse. For the Lord has told him to." And this is at a very low point in David's life. You know, if you could ever see someone just snapping and doing whatever he wants here, it would make a lot of sense. David, in seemingly endless patience, says, let's not resort to these kinds of tactics. Leave him alone, for the Lord has told him to. And we discussed this when we went through it. You may have an alternate translation, something along the lines of, perhaps the Lord has told him to. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he's saying exactly what the Lord wants me to hear. Maybe God sent him. And let's not forget what's recently occurred, going back to chapter 11 or so of this text. This is after his awful blunder with Bathsheba, and things are kind of caving in on his kingdom. And he knows he deserves to die. But he's thinking, maybe God has sent this, and maybe this is just a further cursing of my sin. So David goes along with his men on the road, while Shimei goes along on the hillside opposite, curses him, throwing stones and flinging dust. And it had to be terribly annoying. But the king doesn't do anything about it. Well, we go back to our text, and he reminds his son in verse 8. See, you have a guy named Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite for Bahurim. He cursed me one time with a malicious curse. He came down to meet me. I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Verse 9. Now, therefore, do not hold him guiltless. Son, I can't do anything toward this guy because I made a vow to God. Implying, son, you have not made the same vow that I have. So, consider what could be done in this instance. For you are a wise man and know what you ought to do. But bring his gray hair down to the grave with blood. Isn't that strange? The tune that's being sung here from what we just read, we're going to leave the guy alone, no. And now it's kill him years down the road. He deserves to be executed. Some have suggested that this is some kind of vicious vengeance in which the king is engaging. I'm not too convinced that's the case. Flip over to Exodus chapter 22. Exodus 22, in the original giving of the law, this very matter was to be covered. And we'll read in that spot, verse 28 of Exodus 22. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. And There's some mentioning up above about penalties to be paid, including capital punishment, and I believe that's probably the case in this instance. The rule of the Lord was, you shall not revile God, but just as you cannot speak against God or talk about him in a disrespectful way, you have no right to curse a ruler of your people, whom God has put in place. Of what do we know Shimei was guilty? But cursing a legitimate ruler of his people. And in violation of that law, he deserved to die. And I think it makes a lot of sense in this case. I want to defend David on this one. Because he mentions, hey, look, I've been deposed, and my son has taken over, and, maybe this is what God wants for me. Maybe this is part of my punishment that I have to bear. And I don't think he understands at that time. But the fact that Absalom is overthrown and he's restored back to the kingdom is demonstrative of the reality that God wants him as a legitimate king in place, and now he knows what this man was speaking was not the truth. And so now he knows it lawfully needs to be dealt with. So I don't think this is a matter where David's simply feeling vengeful in his final days, but I think it goes back to what he commands his son in the first 4 verses. Make sure you follow the commandments of God. The commandment of God is, you shall not revile a ruler of your people. And if you do, in that context, capital punishment is discussed. And so according to the law, give this guy what God says he needs. Yeah. Right. So that's nothing's new, right? 1 Peter 2, yeah. Romans 13, along those same lines. Yeah, absolutely, Roy. And a good reminder for us, they don't have to be our best friends, but we need to be very careful in the things that we say about every one of our rulers and in the ways that we would treat them, even in our minds. Just very briefly, we talked about this a few times. There's a difference in the first time that Solomon is put forward as the king of Israel and the second time. The first time is very impromptu. It's kind of pushed the king's hand into action, and that takes place at Gihon whenever Adonijah, a son, tries to take the throne from his father, and he's appointed by the high priest. But the second time, of which we've read, and we've gone through both of these, it takes place at the palace. It's very well methodically planned out, and he's made king by all the assembly, not just by the sitting king, and anointed not just by the high priest, but as well by the entire assembly. We're told at the end of 1 Chronicles, then Solomon sat on the throne of God as king instead of David, his father. And so the second time he officially comes into place, but that's why you have the two. The first one is, the king's already been chosen, and it's almost like a wedding announcement that's sent out. And then the second time, it's actually the wedding that takes place. He's actually appointed as king in this second assembly. So let's look quickly at these last 2 verses of our section, and we'll say goodbye to a great man of God. Not perfect, just like every one of us, but a tremendous servant of the Lord. Verse number 10, so David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. The period, and we're going to come back to this, okay, but stay with me here. The period that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. Interesting numbers. 7 years he reigned in Hebron, you might recall, over the southern kingdom of Judah. And in Jerusalem, where he conquered in the city of the Jebusites, anciently known as Jebus, and he moves the kingdom to that place, moves the ark of God. He reigned in that spot for 33 years. My personal opinion, and you take it for what you will, but that David has the opportunity, I believe, in his life to build the temple and to be the perfect typification of the Savior. But through some of his mistakes, he messes that up. And even though he has a great plan in mind, God says it can't be you. And here's why. It has to be someone else on these grounds. Now, let's read between the lines. If he says it can't be you because of this, choices that David had made, what if David would have made different choices? I believe the implication there is it could have been David, but because of those choices, it could not be him. And all this was beautifully set up. David spends a period ruling over Israel, a total of 40 years. I'm going to put up and show on the screen. Not all of it was hunky-dory. You have 7 very difficult years of war, 7 very difficult years just of trouble, and most of those we've dealt with in the latter portion of 2 Samuel and even over a little bit into 1 Kings. So he has 40 years, and a number of which are filled with difficulty and trial. Anybody else in the Bible stands out who has a difficult period of 40? There are a few of them, really. But, of course, our Savior and the 40 days of temptation that he spends in the wilderness. And it's mentioned that he reigns of those 40 years for 7 years at Hebron, the perfect number in Scripture, a perfect amount of time. And when he assumes the throne over all Israel, strangely enough, he reigns as king for how many years? 33. When Jesus comes, he's recognized to be the son of David and the king over God's people, Israel. And he's with Israel for how many years? Helping them along the way. But for exactly 33 years, now maybe 33 and a half, but we're told Jesus starts his ministry in Luke's account, chapter 3. He's about 30 years of age. Count the Passovers involved until his death. There's 3 of those, and so he's about 33 years of age ruling whenever he dies. And so it's strange, these similarities. And I believe what's suggested is David kind of messes up the type, the perfect type of the Lord. God had it set up perfectly, but he left the choice in his hands. Do you want to be the foreshadowing in every way of my son, or will some of that privilege belong to another? And some of the fallacious choices that he makes, there's a portion of that privilege then that gets shifted to his son, who is a better foreshadower as the ruler or the prince of peace. Okay, so having spoken of those numbers just a little bit, I want to go back to this idea as we close just a minute or so here. In verse 10, so David rested with his fathers, and he was buried in the city of David. What does that mean? David rested with his fathers. Be strong, my son. What's going on with me? Same thing that happens with everybody. But you have a different way that you can look at this. I'm going to rest with my fathers. I'm going to be at peace with our ancestors, probably with your granddad and your hopefully great-grand and other family members, but even if not, wonderful servants of God who have gone on before. The statement's made a lot like this in the Old Testament, and you can find it. It can't be a reference to the person's burial. One example, in the case of Jacob or Israel, he stated to have rested with his fathers. In the burial, of course, he dies and he's buried, but he's not buried for another 40 days, and yet he's resting with his fathers because they have to go back from Egypt to the land of Canaan for that to take place. It's not talking about what happens with the body, but what happens with the spirit. And that's one of the reasons we can be strong whenever our loved ones do, in fact, move on. Do you recall when David, due to his sin, loses the child from the conception from the sinful activity with Bathsheba? And the child dies, and he's so upset when the child might live, but when the child dies, well, he kind of seems okay, and he just goes about life, and his servants don't understand. And what does David explain to them whenever they ask, how can you be handling this so well in the loss of a child? What's he tell them? There you go. He shall not return to me. And he's not being heartless whenever he says that, but it's not going to help matters, if I continue to mourn once he's gone. But he says, there are things I can do to ensure that one day I will go to him. And so he gets to go on to his child, who's already moved on before him, his infant child. He gets to go on to his faithful ancestors, perhaps his dad and maybe granddad and so on, that have already gone on before them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we're reminded we as Christians do not sorrow as those who have no hope, because we know that Jesus is going to come back. He's going to bring with him those who have gone on. Those aren't bodies, those are spirits, who people really are. And the dead will rise first. They'll go to meet the Lord in the air. We who are alive shall go up to meet them and go be with Christ forever. And we're told this, therefore comfort each other with these words. It's a way that we can be strong in these difficult times. The language of David's death seems to suggest an awareness of reunion with his relatives. The king is buried in the city of David, and in that particular part of Jerusalem where his personal troops had conquered in battle against the Jebusites. His tomb will still be in Zion in the day of Jesus and his apostles. Acts chapter 2, verse 29, whenever Peter's teaching that great gospel sermon, he mentions The patriarch David is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day, even as many as 1,000 years later. As we read, the total length of David's reign is 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. What an amazing life it is. No, not a life of perfection, but a life of overall solid direction. The very thing that the Lord expects out of us according to 1 John 1. If we'll lead a life not of perfection, that'd be great. It's not going to happen. But a life of direction, we can say we will have accomplished something by the Lord's grace in the end. And his parting words, my son, be strong. I'm going the way of all people. Now's your chance. Prove yourself to be a man of God. Any other comments through our text, through verse 11? I know it wasn't as expansive of one, but there's some things that need to be refreshed along the way. Okay, so for next week, or I should say 2 weeks, next time we get together, no, 3 weeks. We have a few special things coming up. But the next time that we do get together, please read the rest of, there's a good chunk of chapter 2 left. Please read the rest of that, maybe 36 or something like that verses. And let's memorize the last one, verse 46. 46 of 1 Kings 2. Like 3 weeks or something. All right, looking forward to it.